Hello, and welcome to The Invisible Podcast, where I share my thoughts on creativity and faith. I'm Chris Stetson, and today I'll be talking about practice and rest. Let's get started with practice. What exactly is practice? For some reason, lawyers' offices and doctors' offices are called practices. And back when we were kids, we were always going to t-ball practice, soccer practice, or in my case, roller hockey practice. Yeah, I was one of those kids. I mean, I grew up at the beach. We didn't have ice anywhere. But anyways, at first glance, it might seem that practicing something just means doing it over and over again. And in a way, that's kind of true. But why do we practice? Well, we practice to get better at something. Most people, myself included, don't want to practice or don't like to practice. We'd rather skip all the hard work and just be great at something. But it rarely works out that way. That's because there's a big difference between talent and skill. A talent is something you're born with, a natural ability. But skill? Well, skill is learned. Skill takes time, dedication, and practice. In his book, Practice, Seth Godin puts it this way. Many people have talent, but only a few care enough to show up fully, to earn their skill. Skill is rarer than talent. Skill is earned. Skill is available to anyone who cares enough. The thing is, we don't see the practice of those who care enough. We just see the result. I've mentioned before how I used to swim competitively. So in 2004 at the Athens Olympics, when Michael Phelps won his first gold medal, and then 5 more gold medals plus 2 bronze medals, you could say I became a bit of a fanboy. I mean, come on. This was my sport, and I got teased for wearing Speedos as a kid, and now it's famous and even a little bit cool. Of course, then, 4 years later, Phelps surpassed his previous achievements, winning a total of 8 gold medals, subsequently breaking Mark Spitz's record of 7 gold medals in a single Olympics from 1972. Fun fact, Mark Spitz was also an American swimmer. But did you know that Phelps didn't win any medals at his first Olympics in 2000? At 15 years old, he was the youngest male to qualify for the Olympic swim team in 68 years. So he had talent, but he needed more practice to hone his skill. Phelps started swimming competitively at the age of 7, and by the age of 10, he held his first national record. Clearly, he had talent. He also had to care enough to put in the work, to put in the practice, to get better. Phelps trained under his coach, Bob Bowman, for most of his career. He says that Bowman reminded him of a drill sergeant. Training with Bob is the smartest thing I've ever done, says Phelps. I'm not going to swim for anyone else. So even though Bowman was like a drill sergeant, Phelps wouldn't train with anyone else. He knew that the work was worth it. When you watch Phelps swim, he seems to glide through the water with ease. It looks effortless. You'll see this same thing with many other experts. Basketball players shooting free throws, guitar players running scales. I even watched a video of Julianne Moore walking the streets of New York with Billy Eichner, and she started crying on cue, like really crying with tears and everything, as if someone had just told her that her dog died or something. I felt it just watching her on that video, and you could see that the people there with them were visibly moved, but it was like no effort at all for her. In the Message translation of 1 Corinthians 9:24 and 25, it reads, "Isn't it obvious that all runners on the racetrack keep running to win, but only one receives the victor's prize? Yet each one of you must run the race to be victorious. A true athlete will be disciplined in every respect, practicing constant self-control in order to win a laurel wreath that will quickly wither. But we run our race to win a victor's crown that will last forever. For that reason, I don't run just for exercise or box like one throwing aimless punches, but I train like a champion athlete. I subdue my body and get it under my control so that after preaching the good news to others, I myself won't be disqualified. Like athletes, we must be disciplined in our craft, in the calling God has placed on our lives. We practice not only to get better, but to be excellent. In our striving for excellence, we honor God and the gifts that He's given to us. Putting in the work and caring enough to keep practicing will lead to excellence. As Christ followers and kingdom creatives, being excellent at what we do points back to the excellence of God. It brings glory to the King and reveals the love of Jesus. In Genesis 2:15, when God puts Adam to work the soil of the earth, He calls it good. It wasn't a burden or something that Adam had to gear himself up for to get through his workday. It was a joy to work. I came across an art print recently that said, "The day you plant the seed is not the day you eat the fruit." One thing you may not know about me is that I love plants, but I've not always been the best plant caretaker. I have gotten better and more disciplined with taking care of our houseplants. One of the reasons for that discipline is because I've seen a few of our plants go from small little pottings to large, full houseplants. Specifically, our fiddle-leaf fig trees. One of my favorites and a very popular plant, at least on Pinterest. Back when we lived in San Diego, I really wanted one of those large, room-filling fiddle-leaf fig trees. So I went to Home Depot and bought one of the largest ones I could find, only to realize in the parking lot that I hadn't thought through how I would be bringing this enormous plant home in our Honda CR-V. I ended up sliding back the front passenger seat, placing the pot on the floor, and opening the sunroof to allow the top of the plant room to reach out of the roof. I brought the tree home and set it up in our living room. It looked great for about 3 weeks, until it started wilting. So I gave it some water. Then the leaves started falling off. I asked the internet and got some special plant food, but over the next couple of weeks, leaves continued to fall one or even a few at a time. Eventually, the tree was dead. I had killed it. Now, fiddle-leaf fig trees are notoriously difficult to care for. There could have been any number of reasons or combinations of things that did the tree in. It could have had too much water, or maybe not enough water, maybe not enough sunlight, or maybe it just wasn't too happy after that initial ride home from the store when I crammed it into my front seat. Fast forward to today. We now have 2 fiddle-leaf fig trees that are around the same size and even larger than that first one. They are alive and healthy, and we've had them for a few years now. The difference is, these ones started small and actually in a single pot. Over time, we've cared for them, repotted them, given them the right amount of water and light and plant food. And on occasion, we've pruned them. Our hard work has paid off. Now we've got these 2 trees that bring life into our house, and we're proud to continue putting in the work to care for them and keep them alive and thriving. God will work in your life in a similar way. In Leviticus 23:22, God gives these instructions to the Israelites. "And when you reap the harvest of your land, ye shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. Ye shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." In this passage, God gives instructions to work their fields, but leave the edges for those who don't have their own fields to harvest. I find it interesting that God did not just tell the Israelites to gather their whole harvest and then give some away to the needy. He wanted even the needy to put in the work to harvest what was left for them. As nice as it would be to jump to the result of all your practice and all your hard work, God puts great value on you caring enough to put in the work. After the break, we'll be back to talk about rest. But first, did you know that 1 in 8 couples struggle to get pregnant, and 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage? So chances are, if your family hasn't experienced infertility or miscarriage, you likely know someone who has. My friends Lauren and Billy Bourne created I Am Fruitful to inspire hope in those trying to conceive, dealing with infertility, and suffering through loss and miscarriage. Lauren and Billy have a big heart to encourage and uplift those struggling with infertility and miscarriage. I Am Fruitful connects with women through retreats, online resources, and delivering miscarriage support care packages called Hope Boxes. If you're struggling with infertility or have experienced miscarriage, go now to iamfruitful.org to get connected with their great resources. I Am Fruitful is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is funded through donations, so please consider giving a donation to support them. You can find them online at iamfruitful.org and on Instagram at i.am.fruitful. Please go and check them out and give them your support. Now, let's get back to the show. If there's one thing that goes best with practice, it's rest. God gives us his example of rest right at the very beginning of the Bible. After 6 days of working, he took the 7th day, marked it as holy, and rested. Later, in Exodus 20, we see God actually command the Israelites to honor the Sabbath when he gives them the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. I find it strange that this is the one commandment that most people feel like it's okay to break. In our modern culture, it's often celebrated to work long hours over the weekend and overextend yourself. It's almost like people think they earn some sort of extra credibility for it. But inevitably, these same people will find themselves experiencing burnout. As creatives, like so many other things, we must follow in God's example of rest and honoring a Sabbath day once a week. Let me just read you this scripture from Hebrews 4:9. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. While under the new covenant we may not be bound to adhere to the Old Testament laws for our salvation, we cannot ignore that these laws contain principles for living well and living a life that pleases God. We can find God's wisdom and character in his laws. By setting aside 1 day each week, we honor God. We remember his creation and give glory to him, and this can be a difficult thing to do. When I was working part-time as a freelancer and full-time as a video editor for a church, I had to find the time to work on my freelance projects. And with 3 kids at home, that time was usually found in the evenings after the kids go to bed, and of course, on the weekends. Now, my freelance work wasn't constant. It usually came in seasons. But when I had a big project, or more than one big project, It wasn't uncommon for me to work until 1 or 2 in the morning and then get up and get to the office by 9. This obviously began to take a toll on me, and thankfully, before I experienced any kind of major burnout, God showed it to me. Since my freelance was a good chunk of our monthly income, I often felt a responsibility to say yes to pretty much everything. God showed me that it would be okay if I said no to some projects, and eventually, God told me I needed to say no to all freelance projects. That was a harder pill to swallow. God was calling me to trust Him. By honoring a day of rest, we're putting our trust in God. We're trusting Him enough to not work that extra day. Through this, there is a supernatural result. In our case, when I started saying no to freelance, later that year, I got a promotion and a raise. And on top of that, my wife's freelance photography business exploded. All of that money we thought we would be losing from me saying no to freelance was made up for and then some, because God can do more in 1 day of rest than I can do in 7 days of work. When we set aside a day of rest, we make time to hear from God. I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. You won't be able to hear God when you're busy and you've got your head down in your work. It's when you make the time to get into His presence and invite Him into your space. When you turn everything else off and listen, truly listen for what He is wanting to tell you, He will speak to you and give you guidance. It's an act of obedience. Looking back at Exodus and the 10 Commandments again, God has a reason for including a Sabbath day of rest with the other commandments. In Exodus 31:14 and 15, we see that breaking the Sabbath came with a very severe consequence. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. In Pastor Robert Morris's book, Take the Day Off, he puts it this way. God understands what we clearly do not, namely that a society in which people work 7 days a week is just as vulnerable to collapse as a society in which people are free to rape and murder without any consequence. God was crafting a culture and a people that could survive and thrive so that in the fullness of time, His only begotten Son could enter the world through them. God also commanded that the Israelites Sabbath their farmland, that every 7 years that land would be left fallow. In Leviticus 25:2-5, God says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard." For this, I will just ask you one question. As a creative, what is the promised land that God has delivered to you, and how does He want you to Sabbath that? On more than one occasion, Jesus was rebuked for healing on the Sabbath. But for Jesus, healing was easy. It wasn't work for Him. There are stories of a person asking for healing for someone back at their house far and away, and Jesus just says, yes, they are healed, and then they are. You too can find healing in honoring the Sabbath day of rest. Giving God 1 day each week will bring ideas and blessings on your work that you can't realize. As I said before, God can do more in 1 day of rest than you can do in 7 days of working. If you want to learn more about how to practice a Sabbath day of rest, I highly recommend Pastor Robert Morris's book, Take the Day Off. I also recommend a message from my pastor, Landon Schott, who recently preached on the importance of Sabbath. You can find a link in the show notes to both. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Invisible Podcast, which is written, recorded, and edited by me, with music from Poddington Bear, and special help from my beautiful wife, Erin Stetson. If you'd like to suggest a topic for me to explore, or you just want to say hey, you can email me at helloinvisiblepodcast@gmail.com, or find me on Instagram, @theinvisiblepodcast. To support the show, you can subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And if you've already done that, I really would appreciate it if you would share an episode with a friend, or even more than one friend. Until next time, thanks again for listening.